You weren't supposed to root for them, and yet you did. You felt it when Walter White crossed the line, when Joe Goldberg justified yet another horrible decision, and when Loki betrayed everyone, and you still hoped he'd win. Somewhere along the way, the villain stopped being the enemy, and maybe even became the character that you cared about the most. Why do characters designed to disturb us instead end up fascinating us? Why do morally dangerous people feel more compelling than superheroes? And more importantly, what does this say about us when we actually start to understand them? Because this isn't random. There's a psychological pattern happening here, a predictable one. It can be known as the villain effect, the moment that storytelling and human psychology collide, and the antagonists turn into the center of the story. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it, which is why in my video on narrative amnesia, I talk about when the villain actually starts to fall apart, when their psychology falls apart, the whole story kind of starts to unravel with it because they become the emotional center of the story. And it starts with something very subtle, not approval, not admiration, but recognition. Before we ever root for a villain, we recognize ourselves in them first. Not in their actions or what they do, but what they feel behind those actions. Maybe it's the fear of being powerless, the resentment of being overlooked, the need to be respected, or the desire to finally take some kind of control. These are human emotions, universal ones. And the villains, one of the many interesting things about them is that they express these kinds of emotions and needs without any restraint, without the typical kind of restraint that we might have. And that's where it can get a little bit uncomfortable because these characters, they don't just reflect our emotions, they reflect those parts of us that we typically will try to hide. In psychology, Carl Jung, he talked about this concept known as the shadow self, which is just that, these impulses that we try to suppress, the anger that we try to bury, and the darker instincts that we don't act on. But these anti-heroes, they don't suppress them. They live them out. And that can actually produce a kind of emotional release for us. I'll explain. Usually things that anti-heroes are doing are taboo in some way, that there's usually some kind of social convention or literal laws against them. And so when we see them violate these conventions or laws on screen, it's almost like a way for us to say, okay, I can see what it would be like if I were to do this. Maybe from the distance of safety of, okay, I'm not actually doing it, so I can't get in trouble. But it's interesting to see what it would look like to live in this world. I mean, think about Dexter, for instance. This is somebody who has controlled violence, and he only takes out people according to the code that his father and a psychologist or psychiatrist, I think, helped him to create, to where he only takes out bad people. So people that are predators or people who have offed other folks themselves or a wide range of things. So basically a vigilante. And when we see that, it can kind of tap into that part of us that might crave justice for people who really care about that. And depending on where you live, justice system might not be the best. And so being able to see, okay, what if I was the one that had the power and control to enact justice on these horrible people? And kind of live that out through Dexter. So it could be that, and it could just be almost like a fascination because of these unrestrained, excessive behaviors. So for instance, with Joe Goldberg, seeing how for him, he's driven by the idea of love and how he'll do anything for the person that he loves. And so seeing that idea taken to an extreme, of course, but can be fascinating to see what a person with his attachment style, with that kind of extreme level of obsession, where it can take them to. But again, the key part is that these writers are keeping these people human. Like, these are human feelings and emotions, but they're just expressed without restraint. And so that does, in terms of empathy, the writers, they actually engineer this empathy. It's designed. So they first humanize these villains, and then they escalate their behaviors later. So this person usually has some kind of trauma that happens to them, and then maybe some type of humiliation, and then also maybe some other type of injustice in their life that then for us as the viewer it can shift us from this point of judgment over the person to then this point of more understanding. And I know I'm mentioning Joe Goldberg and you a lot, but it just stands out because I've seen so many comments on so many videos where people are saying like they feel bad for him, they can understand him, etc. And I think it was in season 2, maybe, like, he hinted at how bad his childhood was, and maybe there was glimpses in season 1, but I think it was more season 2 where we got it in more depth and really saw this facet, and that was a big switch for a lot of people to where they are, I would say, over empathizing with him. And so this is very intentional of the writers. They help us to form this allegiance, this emotional allegiance with these villains before this villain establishes this kind of moral collapse to where they start just going off the rails. Because if they just started going off the rails first without any kind of indication of why, that just feels too abrasive. We would automatically look at them as the villain, which in some stories that's not necessarily a bad thing. But for stories that wants us to somewhat empathize with the villain a little bit more, they're not going to do that. And then often, especially with these more modern day, not just the modern day, but a lot of these shows and movies, is we are now living in the POV of the villain themselves. So they might have these really long, going back to you again, these really long inner monologues like Joel Goldberg or other folks where we can kind of get into their head and experience what they're thinking. But the thing is, because they often have these cognitive distortions and twisted way of thinking, they're unreliable narrator. And I plan to discuss that a bit in a future video when it comes to actually Mindhunter and how the main kind of some of the main even detectives are unreliable narrators. But this person doesn't have, or these villains don't have consistent ways of really looking at the world that might fully make sense. So we're looking at their thinking from their distorted point of view. Like we are living inside of their reasoning. And even though we can kind of see that it generally doesn't necessarily seem rational, over time that can shift to where their logic, it makes sense at least for them. Like we can see an action and say, okay, I understand why they did this from their framework as a villain. And then we stop just observing them, but then we can even kind of start aligning with them, especially the more vigilante type villains, we can start aligning with them even more. So as humans, we crave control in an unpredictable world. And don't say that you don't, because that is how your brain is made. And so it does. It craves that kind of control, predictability, because that is safe and that can help keep us alive, that's the brain's goal. And usually these villains, they represent like this kind of agency and a certainty and a dominance. Like they have this kind of unfiltered autonomy, basically. Like they just have complete control over themselves and are usually very kind of self-confident as villains and just walking in their deviance. And when we can see this actually can activate in the brain some of our reward circuitry and even this kind of thrill about seeing a person break this rule, break this law. Like when we see this law breaking behavior, it could activate those parts in our brain. And so it's not saying that like we're actually drawn to evil, but we're actually drawn to this kind of unfiltered, like I said, autonomy to where, gosh, this person could really do whatever they want, and how nice to throw off the shackles of society and do whatever the heck I really wanted to do. We are drawn to that specifically, not necessarily the evil acts this person is doing. And so when it comes to villains versus heroes, heroes represent these ideals. They're like who we'd aspire to be. A lot of the times they're portrayed as often being perfect, or if not, just not as human, meaning they don't necessarily mess up as much as we all do, or they're just so in line with their moral compass, etc. So often we can feel distant from them, like thinking about like a Superman, for instance, who almost seems basically perfect versus some of these other characters like the villains who are and represent more of a psychological realism because they show things like contradiction or rationalization of their behavior or actual internal conflict. Like being morally stable and predictable all the time in terms of the decisions that you're going to make and basically being flawless like heroes are, that feels very distant from our real experience as humans. Versus the villains, and with all these traits that I mentioned before, the inner conflict and the unpredictability and the tension, like that feels more human. And so we often want to root with the people that we can identify and, like I said at the beginning, that we can recognize ourselves in. And thinking about more modern day, these modern villains, a lot of times they expose things for us that we already have problems with. So for instance, they might expose things like systemic hypocrisy or injustice or just these uncomfortable social truths. So they challenge institutions or moralities or our assumptions about things. And so just at an intellectual level that can make them really sticky for us, that can make it even more fascinating because it's okay, this person is doing these actions and maybe they have trauma and I can understand it. And maybe it's because, or we can see it relate to this injustice. Like they're trying to stick up for things that are wrong. And I actually agree with them on certain points. And so with this modern storytelling, we just see layers that again feels kind of true for us, or maybe they're speaking to causes that we agree with as well. And that's probably where things are going to continue to head in the more long term, these more complex villains, because as audiences, we crave that over these pure heroes. Like we want maybe authenticity more so than we just want the picture of virtue, or we crave that complexity, which feels real to our real life, versus more of this certainty. And so this is probably just going to continue in terms of these villains that are complex and leads us to actually root for them. And so, in terms of what this says about us, I just want to emphasize that rooting for these villains does not mean that we support evil. Maybe you do, which I'm scared of you, but doesn't necessarily mean for the majority of us who don't like that we actually support evil. It means that we can understand motivation and that we can really recognize this kind of internal conflict, maybe even contradictions that we might experience when it comes to morality and it comes to certain things like certain systemic issues. And then we value more psychological truth. So again, we don't root for villains because we love darkness. We root for them because they feel real. So I'd love to hear from you all. I know I mentioned some villains and maybe some instances where we realized that we were on their side, but which ones kind of stuck out to you? Maybe which villains made you question your own morality? And maybe what were moments that stuck out that you actually realized, oh, wait, I'm on their side? Let me know in the comments. And thank you for watching this video. And if you got to this point, especially, thank you, thank you, thank you. See you in the next one.